Okay, so hello again. This is the second part of our discussion of some of the key theories for spectatorship in film studies. So again, um, a lot of these theories are essentially that theories. They're based on a lot of it has its fundamental roots in psychoanalytical theory, as opposed to kind of cultural theories. So whereas audience, sort of considering an audience would use quite a lot of sociological readings and stuff like that. This is far more about philosophy and psychology. So if you're doing those courses, like some of the stuff you do, some of the things you study in there might be quite useful. So we started looking at these theorists, including the Frankfurt School, which is the kind of the starting point, really, of a lot of thought on spectatorship, thinking about this kind of illusion of proximity. So I'm going to go on and talk about Christian Metz. So Metz was a theorist very much influenced by Lacan in particular, and you can really go down a rabbit hole with this kind of stuff. It's very, very dense and quite difficult to read, but you can kind of just Google his name. There's loads of free PDFs, and this is one such. There's just all these interviews specifically on film theory. So he's quite useful because he talks quite a lot about film theory. Now, if you're really interested, particularly in kind of horror film and psychoanalytical approaches and things, spectatorship can really help you with that, and that's where it's quite useful, where films are quite kind of impenetrable, like the experimental surrealist films that we study. So anyway, of particular interest to us at this point is the mirror stage that Metz discussed. So, like I said earlier, the mirror stage is when a child recognizes itself in the mirror for the first time. All right, and if you've ever held up, for example, held up a mirror in front of an animal, like a cat, quite often the cat will be confused. They'll think it's another cat, or they'll try and look behind the mirror to see what's there, and they don't really get it. They don't really understand. They think it's another animal because they don't have a sense of self that people do. Because at a certain point, and Metz, quite often suggested that the mirror stage is when we recognize our own reflection. Because we recognize our own reflection, that has an impact on us being aware of our own position within the world, and then that leads to our development of self and ego and all that kind of thing. And he felt that because of that, people enjoy them because of that mirror stage that really influenced why people enjoyed films, because they recognise this version of themselves on screen, often an idealised version of themselves. So if you think about like Indiana Jones or the aforementioned James Bond, Metz would probably argue that the reason that a lot of us kind of respond positively to those kind of things is because we recognise this kind of idealised version of ourselves on screen. So this video kind of explains the mirror stage. So I'm just going to play this.
The mirror stage. He posited that the first time an infant sees itself in the mirror, literally or figuratively, is the moment that the child develops a sense of the self, the I, or the individual identity. Before this, the child doesn't think of himself as an individual at all, but simply exists as a unified subject, indefinable and whole, at one with everything else around them. In this sense, the authenticity and reality of being a whole subject is lost when the child first understands itself as having an identity. This is what causes the split between what Freud called the id, or the unconscious self, the subject, and the ego, the formation of a self that we think of as an I. In doing this, the I becomes another. The ego becomes something altogether apart from the authentic and whole subject that the child experienced before. This new idea of ourselves is developed through use of language, but Lacan insists that it means that we are detached and largely oblivious to our real selves, our own subject. When infants start to develop this new identity, the ego can be ordered in a way that helps the person make sense of themselves and can protect them against the inconsistencies and raw desires the internal subject, unconscious, or id, experiences. This dual relationship between the subject as a whole and what the child learns to perceive as an identity is a relationship between the imaginary and the real. The mirror gives the illusion that the identity and character is whole, when in reality the desires and inconsistencies of life experienced by the subject before the mirror stage are what's authentic and real. For Lacan, psychoanalysis was about helping the patient recover and become more in touch with the authentic self.
Let's stop it there. So, just to kind of break that down in terms of film specifically, the suggestion here is that once we become aware of ourselves by looking at ourselves and by being aware that we have a mirror image, that mirror image places us within the rest of the world, and it allows us to see our place within the rest of the world, literally. But it's also flipped, because obviously, as we all know, like mirror images are exactly that. They're not exact reproductions because they're mirrored back, and because of that kind of distortion, Lacan, kind of talked about, we see an image of ourselves in the world around us, and that allows us to make sense of it, and that allows that kind of sense of self and that awareness of us being not part of the background, but something that interacts with the background, as being the formation of our sense of self. Now, in terms of film studies, the mirror is the screen, right? It's the television that we see things on. So as soon as we start seeing ourselves represented on screen, or a version of ourselves, we can lose ourselves within that. And just to go back to Mulholland Drive, this thumbnail here, you can see on the left hand side, is Naomi Watts from her character, playing her character in Mulholland Drive. So some films do kind of experiment with this quite a lot, and again, it's something to look out for and to bear in mind in Mulholland Drive, because there's layers. I think that we see a representation of people on screen, and obviously those people are drawn with broad strokes because it's an hour and a half, 2 hour long film, and you have to kind of compress, take away like important things about people, because otherwise films wouldn't be interesting. So we have this kind of version of ourselves that we can identify with, but then the character within the film has a mirror image of themselves as well, and there's a lot of kind of layers going on there. I mean, in terms of film, a big clue is whenever you see a character reflected in the mirror, they're not quite as they seem, and they're normally not to be trusted, particularly if they're not the main character. And it's something to kind of to look at. And Lynch, as an auteur, quite frequently returns to those mirror images of characters as well. And if you're familiar with a lot of Lynch, you'll know that. Anyway, so that's quite complex, because you're talking about like psychoanalytical theory and sense of selves, and kind of all this kind of stuff. But essentially, the idea in terms of film studies is the mirror is the screen, and it reflects a version or an idealized version of ourselves. Okay. So, like I said, if you want to work through more Lacan stuff there, Metz there, you're welcome to. And his idea was from Lacan, but Metz situates that specifically in film. So what I want to do now is kind of talk about Mulvey. So she's Laura Mulvey is a British theorist and psychoanalytical theorist, and she's very much influenced by Lacan and Metz as well. But she approaches this from a feminist point of view. So you can see there I've got a hyperlink to Visual Pleasure in the Narrative Cinema, which is this. And this is a whole essay. It's very kind of pivotal, important essay. And I really do recommend you read this, because it's only a few pages long, apart from anything else. But also it's kind of how you write intelligently about film. But I'm going to summarize it here. So she says that the framework of film is voyeurism, right? Because to watch something is literally to look. And quite often in a film, you have a main character who is looking throughout the film. So he has an active male gaze, right? So he's normally a male character. That generally speaking, the majority of leading characters within the film are male, and then we see the film through their eyes. So then the audience, therefore, is gendered male, right? So what will happen throughout any kind of film is that the male character will look at women, right? And the women will kind of will perform for that man, so it will be looked at from their point of view, and the women will perform no real kind of narrative function significantly. They'll exhibit what Mulvey calls to be looked atness. Okay, so they're there kind of as, for want of a better phrase, eye candy, but they're also never to be trusted. They're also normally lead, especially in a film noir, characters to their doom and destruction. So what we're going to do is have a look at this scene from Gilda, and what I want you to do is kind of think about the framing and the kind of mechanics of the shot. Okay, so it's just very short. I love this sequence. So at this point, we have the main character who we're following around, and he meets up with a friend of his who's just going to introduce him to his new wife.
Gilda, are you decent?
Me?
Every time. Brilliant. So funny.
Sure, I'm decent.
Okay, so if we look at this from the male point of view, right, so immediately we have a medium close-up of a sort of elderly man. Well, he looks quite old, doesn't he? Look at that hairline. And he is kind of dressed up, he's got a cravat and all that kind of stuff. Then you can hear the music, which suggests that there's a character. Now, the music is jazz. Jazz has always been kind of associated with sexuality in popular culture. So this kind of raunchy music, which is kind of singing along. And then he kind of looks proudly at our other character. So our other character is double framed in the doorway. So he is kind of through a gateway into this world. And now look, he's looking off screen towards the right, and we follow his point of view.
Gilda, are you decent?
And now look at Gilda.
Me?
Right. Now look at how close that is. Like, so we have a 3/4 frame shot. It's a nice close up, really kind of nice lighting. Now if we look again at the kind of crop juxtaposition of the shots, so we have a long shot here. He's kind of coming in, he's coming over the threshold, and he sees this female character
Me?
toss her hair back. Me. Now, you can look at her costuming as well. So her costuming, all of a sudden as well, significantly, this is shallow focus as well, so she's really isolated and emphasised within the frame. So you can see here, she's wearing very little. There's a kind of pretty big suggestion of nudity there with the bare shoulders and stuff. Then we get a close-up reaction shot. So what? And then she returns the gaze. Now look.
Sure.
She covers up her shoulder, but the one furthest away from the screen. All right, so the male audience cannot be sort of cheated from this, their sort of suggestion of sort of nudity.
I'm decent.
And that kind of play on words about being decent as well. And there's so much going on within that just one shot. So there's that one little sequence. So this is the kind of thing that Mulvey's talking about, where we experience everything in a screen from the male character's point of view. And if you want a little bit more from Mulvey, she's here talking about this. Now, if you want to see like the male gaze in action, have a look at this, and have a look at the kind of the visual language within it. We'll do that in a minute, but this is well worth a look as well, because this kind of expands this. Okay, so we'll kind of finish up there. So it's at the Frankfurt School, Metz and Mulvey, and then what we'll do is apply Mulvey to this sequence entitled Eyes on Michaela from Transformers from 2007.